As a park ranger in the vast, untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, I had always prided myself on knowing every inch of the terrain: the deep, dense forests, the hidden lakes, the trails that wound through ancient trees. It was my domain. I was stationed at Cedar Ridge National Park, a sprawling expanse of wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. My name is Jack Lawson, and this is the story of the night I realized that no amount of knowledge could prepare me for what lay beyond the edge of the known world. It was late autumn, and the park was starting to empty out. The summer tourists had long since departed, leaving behind only the most seasoned hikers and campers, the kind who knew how to handle the colder, harsher conditions of the coming winter. For me, this was the best time of year: the solitude of the forest, the crisp air, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a distant owl. It was everything I loved about the job. But this year, something felt different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a sense of unease that settled in my gut and wouldn't go away. The animals were behaving strangely. Deer that normally grazed near the ranger station had vanished. Birds that usually filled the trees with their songs were nowhere to be found, and the nights were unnervingly quiet. One evening, as I was finishing up my rounds, I received a radio call from a hiker named Steve who had gone off trail earlier that day. He was supposed to be back by now, but his wife, who was waiting at their campsite, hadn't seen him in hours. She was worried, and rightly so. The weather was starting to turn, and the last thing anyone wanted was to be caught out in the woods after dark. I grabbed my gear and headed out to the area where Steve was last seen. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and a cold wind had picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. The trail was well worn, but the deeper I went, the more I felt that nagging sense of unease growing. The forest, normally alive with the sounds of nature, was deathly quiet. I reached the spot where Steve had last been seen, a clearing by a small, tranquil pond. His footprints were visible in the soft earth, leading away from the trail and into the denser part of the woods. I followed them, calling his name, but there was no response. The light was fading fast, and I knew I had to find him soon. As I pushed deeper into the forest, I noticed something odd. The trees around me were different, taller, older, and twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. The air felt heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something metallic. I continued on, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Then I heard it, a low humming sound, faint at first but growing louder as I moved forward. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard in the woods before, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the air. I stopped, straining to listen, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from up ahead, deeper into the forest. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of there before it was too late. But I couldn't. I had a job to do. And Steve was out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly worse. I pressed on, the humming growing louder with each step. The trees around me were so thick now that the sky was barely visible through the canopy. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. When it came back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the clearing ahead, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light, was a massive metallic structure. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, tall, sleek, and covered in strange, pulsating symbols that glowed with a faint blue light. The humming was coming from the structure, a steady rhythmic thrum that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath my feet. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat. As I approached, I saw movement, figures, small and humanoid, moving around the base of the structure. They were shrouded in shadow, their features obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. Suddenly, one of them turned, its eyes catching the light of my flashlight. They were large, black, and emotionless, set in a pale, elongated face that was both alien and terrifying. The figure made a sound, a high-pitched clicking noise that sent a chill down my spine. The others joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of inhuman sounds that filled the air. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away. The figures began to move towards me, their movements smooth and deliberate, as if they were gliding over the ground. I could see now that they were not human, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, my flashlight swinging wildly as I ran. The humming grew louder, the air vibrating with it, and I could hear the creatures behind me, their voices rising in a maddening chorus that echoed through the trees. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing thicker, the undergrowth denser, but I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I burst out of the trees and onto the main trail, nearly collapsing in relief. I could see the lights of the ranger station in the distance, a beacon of safety in the dark. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs shaking with exhaustion, my mind racing with fear. I reached the station and slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing against it, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no making sense of it. I had seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and it had seen me. I grabbed the radio and called for backup, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. I could barely get the words out, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself, but I had to try. Hours passed before the other rangers arrived, and by then, the forest had returned to its usual eerie silence. We searched the area where I'd seen the structure, but there was nothing there. No sign of the metallic tower, no trace of the creatures, not even a footprint. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew that something was out there, something beyond our understanding, something that had been watching us from the shadows. The next few days were a blur of questions, investigations, and sleepless nights. The other rangers were concerned, but skeptical. They chalked it up to stress, to overwork, to an overactive imagination. But I knew the truth. I had seen something in those woods, something that didn't belong. I tried to go back to work, tried to put it behind me, but the memory of that night haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black, soulless eyes staring back at me, heard the maddening chorus of inhuman voices. I couldn't escape it, couldn't forget it. Then, a week after the encounter, I received a call from the hiker's wife. Steve had never been found. The search teams had combed the area for days, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. That night, as I sat alone in the ranger station, I heard the humming again. Faint at first, but growing louder, filling the air with its unnatural vibration. I looked out the window, and in the distance I saw it, the same eerie blue light flickering through the trees, coming closer, getting brighter. I knew then that it wasn't over. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Steve, was coming for me. I had seen too much, learned too much, and now there was no escape. The humming grew louder, the light brighter, until it filled the room, blinding me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see them, the creatures standing in the room with me, their black eyes boring into mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The light engulfed me, and the last thing I remember was the feeling of being lifted off the ground, weightless, as the world faded to black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground in the middle of the forest, alone. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows through the trees. My head was pounding, my body aching, but I was alive. I staggered to my feet, looking around, but there was no sign of the creatures, no trace of the light. It was as if the whole thing had been a dream, a nightmare, but I knew it was real. I could still feel the cold touch of their hands, still hear the humming in my ears. I made my way back to the ranger station, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers, only questions. I never told anyone about that night. Not the other rangers, not the authorities. I knew they wouldn't believe me, would think I was crazy, but I knew the truth. I knew that something was out there, something that defied explanation, something that was watching us. I left the park a few weeks later, unable to stay in those woods any longer. The memory of that night, of those creatures, haunted me, and I knew I would never be the same. Even now, years later, I can still hear the humming in my dreams, still see those black eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I've tried to move on, to forget, but it's impossible. Some things can't be forgotten, can't be explained, can't be escaped. And I know, deep down, that they're still out there, watching, waiting, and one day they'll come back for me. Like and subscribe for more stories like this.